Computer Science and Engineering Colloquia features accessible talks by leading computer scientists and computer engineers from across the region and around the world.
So I'm very pleased today to introduce our colloquium speaker, Curtis Heimerall. Curtis got his undergraduate degree in computer engineering from our department here. He then went on to Berkeley, did his PhD research in information and computation for development, working with Stepan Parikh and Eric Brewer. And today he's going to tell us about his work on community cellular networks.
Thank you. I want to first mention a couple of my colleagues. Of course, as any work involves a great many people. The top two, Shadi Hassan and Kashif Ali, were two people who I've worked with closely for a couple of years now on this project. And of course, my two advisors, Stepan Parikh and Eric Brewer. So the structure of this talk is that we're first going to talk about cellular telephones broadly and the problems of cellular access throughout the world. It turns out there's around 1 billion people who don't have cell phone coverage, and that's what we're trying to address. Next, I talk about community cellular. This is our answer to the question of rural access. It's basically locally owned cell phone networks. From there, we're going to talk about virtual coverage, which is our solution to reduce the power draw of these networks, making them more viable. GSM whitespace, which is our solution for regulating these networks. And future work in community cellular, disaster relief, and a couple other areas that I think are ripe given this technological shift. So, cell phone networks, right? This is a map of cell phone coverage throughout the world. The yellow is 3G, the brown is 2G. It's kind of an old map, so there's not a lot of 4G. But what you can see is that cell phone networks are incredibly pervasive. There's around 3.5 billion people on the cell phone network, people, not subscribers. This is larger than the internet, despite not having quite been alive for 25 years yet. So the uptake is enormous. But the uptake is almost entirely in these sort of urban, developed parts of the world. You can see all this white space available. There's around 1 billion people who just live outside of cell phone coverage. And that's the problem we try to resolve. So we're going to step into this particular country, Indonesia, as an example of the problems of access. So this is a map of cell phone coverage in Indonesia. You can see in the bottom, this island here, I should apparently be using my little pointer thing. Here we go, yeah, is the island of Java. It's probably the most densely populated island on Earth. And the cell phone coverage is similarly great. Up here is Sumatra, a little bit worse, but still pretty good. But when you come to this northern island, this is Borneo or Kalimantan. And you can see that the coverage is on the outside. This is where all the people are, basically. But once you go to those less dense areas, that coverage falls out. And it gets even worse when you get to this island. This is the island of Papua. And you see this very sparse coverage throughout the entire island. So we'll step down into Papua. Papua is a really interesting place. It's one of the most sparsely populated places on Earth. And it's also one of the largest islands on Earth. So there's only 2.9 million people on this island. So it's around 9 people per square kilometer. But they're all in the really dense urban parts. There's Jayapura in the top. There's no infrastructure to the island. And this turns out to be one of the reasons there's no cell phone access. It turns out there's no fiber. So basically everything is done over satellite, these very small aperture terminals, VSATs. And the worst place for coverage is this central mountainous band. It's called the Highlands. And Wamena is the capital of it. And Wamena actually has cell phone coverage because it's mostly correlated with density. But once you leave Wamena, that gets bad very quickly. And so we step into one of these communities. This is the community of Deza. It's about a 4-hour drive from Wamena. And there's this one road. You can see it here. It often gets blocked with broken trucks, and you get stuck for a long time. Deza is a really interesting place in a number of ways. There's no census for this kind of community. So we did a little informal estimate. There's around 1,500 people here. So plenty of people to support a network, but it's other reasons that there's no cell phone coverage. It's around 300 homes. Interestingly, and this is a little bit of an aside, there's an enormous amount of phones in the community, despite there being no cell phone access. This might be counterintuitive. We were able to count the number of phones because we were on a cell phone network, but people use the phones there as a media device. Right? There's no television where there's no cellular. There's no radio where there's cellular. So what you do is you take a phone, go to Wamena, get a bunch of music, bring it to the village, play music with your friends. So the phones are there, the people are there, but there's still no cell phone network. And broadly, there's very little infrastructure in Deza, right? There's no power, like community power in this area. There's no community network, there's no cell, no internet, and there's no community water. What you see are these sort of one-off solutions. On the top, let me move my cursor again, right here, is a 10-watt solar panel. And this was used to charge phones at a house in the community, as well as run a small karaoke machine. And on the bottom is an example of one of these VSAT terminals. This is how they brought internet into the school. So they use this to do educational content for the school. So what you see are these sort of local solutions to power and network and water, and no community solutions. But So why is it that DESA doesn't have these community solutions? And it's not the cost of the access point. It turns out in both the urban and rural context, the cost of like a GSM endpoint is very similar. This is what you'd expect. It's actually the same gear. It's the cost of everything else. Right? For example, the mount. This is like what holds the equipment. So in an urban area, you put it on a roof. And in New York City, roof access is very expensive. But in Owamina or Surabaya, much less so. But in a rural area, you actually have to bring a tower. And it's not just bringing a tower, like there's poles. You have to bring concrete. And you have to bring this like digger to dig a hole for you to set the concrete. And then you have to actually haul all this stuff in over a really bad road. So what we've heard is that a tower in a rural area is $50,000 by itself. There's similar things for other pieces, right? Backhaul. In an urban area, it's just wired. You plug into the wall, you've got internet. In a rural area, you have to bring a carrier-grade microwave link. And this is $20,000 a pop. So all of these things build up, right? There's similar stuff for power. Transportation is hard to make rural areas more expensive than urban areas. And this is broadly why there's no coverage, right? At the same time as there's less people, costs are higher, and their curves cross, and coverage is no longer viable. Our solution to this is a thing we call community cellular networks. These are cell phone networks that are owned and operated locally within the community. These sort of local solutions we have for power and network, we're trying to do with cellular. These are small scale. We're not talking about building a brand new nation scale telecom. We want to cover a community in the exact same way that a single solar panel allows you to charge a phone. We want a single unit that allows you to run a cell phone network. And one of the most interesting pieces of this is that they can support local goals because they're local equipment. When you're running a national scale telecom, it's hard to do certain things. Let's say you wanted to give free cell phone coverage to nurses in the community. Now, if you do that nationally, you have to validate who is and isn't a nurse. But when you're a part of that community, it's kind of an obvious thing. You know who's working in that community. So this gives us a great platform to explore those kind of questions. So why is it that a locally owned network is economically viable when the bigger ones aren't? Again, it's not the price of the access point. It's going to be the same in both cases, but it's everything else. So instead of installing a tower, if you're a part of the community, you can use the resources available in the community. And this could be as low as a tree to mount the equipment instead of bringing in a new tower. You're a part of the community, you know which trees are strong, which trees aren't. Similarly, for backhaul, instead of bringing a brand new carrier-grade microwave link, you can use an existing shared consumer-grade VSAT in the community. So allowing us to share the infrastructure to reduce the cost. And this continues, right? Power is easy to share, and getting things in and out of community is what the community knows best. So what we've seen is that a traditional base station, or traditional installation in rural areas, is upwards of $250,000. And we've been able to do it for an order of magnitude less, around $15,000. So the technology we built to support this is a tool and a set of services we call the Village Base Station. And the Village Base Station is a complete cell phone network in a box. It's not just an endpoint, but we took everything that exists in a cell phone network. These are the base station controller, the home location register, just an enormous list of acronyms, and dragged them into the box, running co-located, as well as putting a couple services on top so that people can run a business. This is stuff like billing, routing, interconnect out to the global cell phone network. So it's everything you need to be a cell phone network provider, and we put that together. Here's what the actual hardware looks like. You can see this wonderful cardboard grad student job I have down here. But what it is in the inside is a commodity PC running a software-defined radio that basically outputs cellular signals. On the right, you can see our installation in the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. We ran a small spot in Berkeley for our original testing. But it's just a microwave-sized box that you can lug up, rope into place, and run a network. Yeah?
So I'm wondering as to why cellular carrier cannot actually do the same thing you guys are doing. I mean, today when you have to deploy a tower, they have to do some kind of an analysis of which is the right spot to do a tower. That can be modified to find out what is the right tree to basically deploy the access point. So or they can also use like a shared wireless thing to basically reduce that cost. So
Well, there's a lot of benefits to operating locally with everything in the box, right? The backhaul requirements are actually less. Normally, like a registration message goes from the phone to the base station to the data center, presumably in Jakarta and back. And we're able to do a lot more of that locally, which enables some of these shared solutions that weren't available before. But more broadly, the telecoms aren't built for that in a model because they need to run at a very large scale. And these sort of ad hoc solutions that are available per community are things that they can't leverage very easily. So what you see is them buying 100 Huawei base stations at a time and buying towers in bulk similarly. So it's just antithetical to the model of cellular in a way to do this sort of distributed model. It's much more internet-like than cellular-like. And so, yeah, given the right technology, like an engineer there could have built this just as much as I built this, because I'm just an engineer. But they're not going to, because it's just not the way that they do things. So this is the inside of the unit. I don't want to spend too much time on architecture. The important thing to point out is that we built a system, and there's a lot of moving pieces. There's messages flying all over the place. I want to call out a couple. The first is OpenBTS. So OpenBTS is the open source implementation of cellular, basically. What it does is it converts from cellular to voice over IP. And on the inside, we're able to use voice over IP tools, which are often free and open source, to route communications. One example of this is FreeSwitch, which is an open source SIP switch. So from here, we can route calls, provide services, build new services into the network. And on top of these as our platform, we built a couple software stacks, libVBTS and VBTS Web, which provide hooks for FreeSwitch to look into the cellular state. Things like phone numbers, which can sometimes be, are basically different in VoIP than they are in cellular, we're able to sort of bridge over. And there's a whole bunch of stuff for that. But from there, all the communication goes out through the whatever backhaul we have, probably a VSAT, to some cloud solutions that we put together. So on top of this platform, we built a bunch of stuff to be a cell phone network. The most important one, I shouldn't say the most important, one of the important ones is a SIM registration. One of the details of cell phone networks is that your SIM card actually doesn't have a phone number on it. Instead, the network provides that. This allows number portability, basically. You can switch phone numbers without changing SIM cards. But we needed a mechanism to associate a phone number with a SIM card. We built that. There's, of course, actual service, voice and SMS. And this is both local and global. And so going to the earlier question, like local calls stay local. We don't need them to go over the backhaul. But with the traditional cellular model, they do. So this is some of the flexibility that you get when you're running your own network. This way, only the global communications, that being out to the global telephony network, are using the backhaul. We built a prepaid credit transfer system. If you've ever been in any of these areas, almost everything is done with a prepaid system. Basically, you have a bunch of credits on your phone, and those get decremented down as you communicate. And then we built a transfer service similar to M-Pesa in a way that allows you to move credits between phones via an SMS. So this is all sort of infrastructure so that people can run a cell phone network. And then there were a couple shortcodes. For instance, if you send an SMS to 888, it will return how many credits you have in your phone. But in general, the idea here was to build out everything you need to be a cell phone network. So this is all great, right? We built a thing, it sits in the lab, but this is IT-CTD research, and it needs to be done in the field. It needs to be validated by real users. And we deployed our unit in DESA. We deployed it in partnership with a couple organizations. The first is a primary school in the community. And they actually handle the day-to-day operations of the network. Two of the teachers at the school basically manage the network as a side job. We also partnered with a technical ISP in Wamena. So they're about 4 hours away, but they already managed that VSAT. They're there to come in and provide technical help if there's ever a problem. And we were able to do what I was talking about in terms of sharing infrastructure in the community by sharing both power and network. So there was a 5,000 kilovolt amp hydro that was in place. We were able to just plug into that. And there was similarly a 512 kilobit VSAT that we were able to plug into, reducing the cost of the installation quite a bit. And it was then installed on school property let me see if, no, that's not the next picture. So one of the interesting things is, as a researcher, you want to make as few decisions as possible about the network. You trust that the local community knows that better than you. So we handed off the pricing as an example of one of the decisions to the network operator. And they selected that they wanted to run a for-profit network. That's the only thing they had seen be sustainable in these communities. And then set these as the prices. Now, a couple things to note is that, first off, outgoing communications are significantly more expensive than local communications. That makes sense. Local communications are actually free to the operator. But one interesting thing was the operator did not want to make local communications free. They somehow thought it would be abused. But again, as researchers, we didn't push back too hard because they know better than we do. So the payment system, how people pay for credit, is actually really interesting how it manifested. So at the top, you have the school, and we gave them a website, basically, for them to add credits to certain phones. So what they do is they actually just use that to add roughly 1 million rupiah, which is around $100, to a teacher's phone. And this teacher would then be the primary actor in the network. This was at cost, I say, but obviously the credits don't actually cost anything to the school. But So then the teacher has 1 million rupiah on their phone, right? Then they go to the stores, which are called kiosks in Indonesia, and they sell that for a small markup to the kiosk owners, but still in bulk. So they sell maybe 100,000 rupiah and a chunk to each of the kiosks. The kiosks then resell that to users at, again, a larger markup. So this is the way sort of credit flowed down to individual people in the network. The school did this because they didn't want people knocking on the door at all hours, basically. But this structure was, again, totally devised by the community. On the right, you can see the price list at one of the kiosks. And you can see their markup. It's like 10,000 costs you 12,000 rupiah, 100,000 costs you 110,000 rupiah. So if you buy in bulk, you save some money. Yeah?
Could you put back to the previous slide with the costs and what is the average annual income here? This actually seems fairly expensive.
It is fairly expensive. So then, let's say the average income is nearly impossible to know. Again, there's no census, and there's some agricultural work, there's some subsistence. It's really hard to know what the wages are in the area. But the best comparison I can give is the cost of alternatives. So if you were to do a local call on Telkomsel, the carrier in the country, it's around 10 cents a minute. So this is significantly higher. But before us, there were satellite phones, and those are $1.50 a minute. So relative to the satellite phones, this is significantly better. Relative to the national rate, it's not. It's one of those interesting things. Again, we didn't make this decision. Our price, we originally did and then stepped back from it, and our prices were significantly lower. But these guys have been running businesses and stuff for a while, and they had their own metrics. But yeah, the cost is higher than the rest of the country. So here's two pictures of the actual installation. On the top are two teachers doing the installation, and on the bottom is one of the techs from the ISP. So it actually literally is in a tree, and my favorite piece about this tree is that this tree was already the radio tree before we got there. They had been doing long-distance Wi-Fi on this. So it's one of those pieces of community infrastructure that you might not anticipate being there, but is. So our gear literally just got attached to the same pole and provided coverage for the community, as well as they were broadcasting to a nearby community on long-distance Wi-Fi. So here's the total cost of the installation of the network. The box itself is $6,000. The backhaul is around $1,000. This is paying for a portion of the VSAT cost. Similarly, paying for a portion of the hydro installation. Even though they were already there, we thought it was fairer to say that we paid a portion rather than paying none, for a total installed cost of $9,000 for a running network. To give an example of similar prices nearby, a community near ours actually paid Telkomsel to do an install, and they paid $500,000. And the network was dead in 6 months. Basically, the jungle overgrew it, and they're not sending a tech out. It's too far. So our network is still alive. It's been over 2 years now, and that's going to be the next step, sustainability of the network. So this analysis is a little more detailed. It started in February 11th, 2013, when the network went live, and ended June 12th, 2014. So the network is still running, but this is a specific chunk of data analyzed. There were a couple hacks in place for this. We used Swedish phone numbers instead of Indonesian numbers, and it didn't have global voice. You could only call locally. You couldn't call out. Those were changed in August, and now we have both Indonesian numbers and global voice, but this analysis doesn't take that into account. There's no data service. There remains no data service. It's a really interesting question of when they're going to want to turn that on, but the key point is that the network is still running. So here's the number of users over time in the network in these 16 months. You can see this initial jump. I should be using my cursor. This initial jump to around 100 users. Just people came in, busted down our door, wanted SIM cards. And then you see kind of linear growth that seems to be tailing off a little bit. And so we're expecting that we're actually hitting roughly the number of households in the network. We may be beginning to saturate users. There's one caveat in this particular graph, which is that this is the count of SIM cards sold. But people lose SIM cards. So we're double counting for sure. Our estimate is somewhere between 300 and 350 active subscribers in the network. But that's a significant portion of a community of 1,500 people. So we do have that kind of adoption. Here's the service usage in the network. The key points of this graph, there's a couple. The most important one is to note how important outbound communication is. Sometimes people build networks expecting to connect the community to itself. But what you see is that communicating out of the network, this is to Wamena, this is to Jakarta, this is to Makassar, is way more important for the vast majority of communications. Except for a couple weird points, this particular spike here, we have no idea what happened. Everybody just started talking locally. This was after I had done the field work, and so we don't know what happened, but it seems to have come back down. There is this dip. That was a problem with our message queue in the cloud, but it was remedied. And you can see that voice is generally less important. Indonesia is a texting country. This is why we picked global texting instead of global voice at the start. And then a steady amount of credit transfer going on. So here's the total revenue in the network, which is one of the big questions of sustainability. Right? There's been over 570,000 messages sent in those 16 months, generating a little over $15,000 in revenue. And this is on a $9,000 installation. So it seems like it's a sustainable practice. But revenue is not exactly sustainable. You got to ask questions about the operational expense of the network as well, and we did that. So this is a graph of the two models we did for the broader sustainability story. So we picked two models here. The first you can see right here is the shared model. This is assuming we pay just a portion of the internet, just a portion of the power, in which case our total capital expenditure is around $9,000. For the unshared model, we buy everything. Install a new VSAT, install new solar panels, all of this stuff. At that point, our cost is $15,000. So under these two models, we have these operational expenses. Usage fees are the same in each one. For the VSAT, we pay a portion if we're sharing. We pay all of it if we're not sharing. And we do pay for a maintenance technician to come out if there ever is a problem, and we settled that at $100 a month. So assuming a 5-year loan, we're going to finance this installation at the World Bank rate for Indonesia. Here's the profitability numbers in the network. And you can see it's profitable under all cases. 0 users per month in growth basically means that the numbers we've seen, like the growth that we've seen, it just stopped growing all of a sudden. We would still be making $370 a month in the shared model in profit and $70 a month in the non-shared model. But if we see even reasonable growth, we've seen at least 10 users a month in general. It goes higher to around $400 a month and $100 a month for the non-shared model. So it really is a sustainable, profitable installation for the local operators. And it's not even just profitable for the operators. Here's the analysis of the profit for the credit sellers in the network. Now, this analysis is only over 6 months. It's hard to pin down their markup rates because they change up all the time. So we sat down and did like a deep analysis for a little bit. The primary is the teacher. It's a guy named Adit at the school. And so he has a smaller markup because he's selling in bulk, but he sells more. So he makes about $40 a month being the seller, which is around a 20% bump in his wages. And he gets paid a very good rate for the area because he's working at a very good school. Now, the secondaries are actually the kiosk owners. And you can see they had a little price war. This one's at 19.3%, and this one's at 15.8%. So secondary 2 cut his prices in order to get a larger spot of the market, and he did, making $85 a month and doing an enormous amount of transactions. So this money is also flowing out to the people involved in the network broadly, not just the operators. So this is great, right? We think we've shown that this is a sustainable network installation. It's been live for 2 years, and it hasn't been live like I need to go back and massage connections and manage relationships. It's just been going. I went back to do data collection and to do a software upgrade. That was my big trip back, which is kind of unheard of in the space of rural access. There's been a lot of projects bringing sort of other technologies there, and they've been much higher maintenance. It's making revenue for the owner, the operator, and the staff, really everyone involved. And I think that one of the most interesting pieces of this is that after we turned on Indonesian numbers, usage spiked quite a bit. So we're pretty clear that we're over $30,000 in revenue at this point. It's a very profitable installation for the local operators. So we, of course, believe in the value of qualitative research. I'm not going to go into too much depth on our user interviews. I think it's somewhat out of scope, but I wanted to hit a couple high points. The first high point is really just doubling down on this point that people use this for outbound communication. What you see is Garrett and Paulus both, basically, the network allows them to no longer take a day trip to Wamena to communicate with someone. Sometimes it's someone in Wamena, sometimes it's family members. You see a lot of mobility in a community like this because there's not a lot of job opportunity in Desa. Instead, what people do is they go to a school in Jakarta, in Surabaya, and Makassar because that's the way out, basically. And so then their parents have to travel to Wamena to communicate with them, and now they use our network instead. So this outbound communication was the driving use case. The bottom case of Selena, I think, is really interesting. So Selena is one of the teachers, or was one of the parents, and they're really worried, basically, that their kids can text each other now, when before they couldn't. They could like manage their kids. And this is one thing that we were pretty aware of. It seemed as though, like in our discussions with them, they didn't blame the network. They kind of viewed technology as inevitable. And so it was just a thing they had to deal with. But it's one of those interesting caveats that arrive when you start bringing technology to some areas. I have this wonderful story about Footloose that if anyone wants to ask me personally, showed up as well. So that's great, right? Now we've got a sustainable network, people like it, people are using it. Well, what do we do now? Well, what we decided to do was like sit down and say, hey, how do we make this even cheaper? Because it looks like that price is one of the most important features. And so here's the price of a non-shared base station, like all the components. And what you can see is that power is the primary cost in the installation. So if we want to reduce the cost of the base station and the total install, we're going to need to reduce the power of the network. So let's look at the inside of the box and figure out what we can do. There's the CPU, right? This is an Intel N280 Atom. Like, it doesn't draw a lot of power. There's not much you can do. 10 watts. There's a switch. It's a negligible amount of power. There's a duplexer that's actually passive. There's a software-defined radio, only 10 watts, not a big deal. And then we got a big honking power amplifier taking 130 watts. So if we want to reduce the power draw of this network, we have to touch the power amplifier. That's what virtual coverage does. So to go through my wonderful diagram here, at the center is the cell phone network, or tower. On the little smiling happy people are little smiling happy users, and the dotted line is our cell phone coverage. So the big idea of virtual coverage is basically to turn off the power amplifier when the network is idle or not in use. And then still have the base station awake and listening so that users can wake it up if they want to communicate. So what you see in a network is that people are like communicating all the time, right? But there's a lot of periods of time, like at night, where there's just nothing going on. And this is exacerbated in rural areas where there's just less people, so there's less going on. So in virtual coverage, we just turn the network off. We just turn the power amplifier off, actually. And we have a mechanism for users to send a radio burst to the tower, which is still awake, just not broadcasting. And so it hears the message and wakes up. So we built two ways to do this. On the top right, you can see Osmocom BB. This is the open source cellular baseband implementation. What we did is we stepped in and modified the GSM protocol on the handset so that it remembers the last tower it was on. And then if you try to make a call when out of cell phone coverage, it will send the radio burst to that tower's frequency. If the tower awakens, the phone will immediately connect and your call will go through. So if you're using this device, it adds roughly 2 seconds to your call. You don't see signal, but if you try to make a call, the call will go through in 2 seconds. Now, there's 10 billion GSM phones on Earth. We will not be able to change the baseband of even a tenth of them. So we need a solution that does not require a modified baseband. And that's the bottom one. That's the wake-up radio. The big idea of that, it's just a small IC that we built, and it just broadcasts on the same frequency. You actually tune it for a specific tower, and then come and press the button if you want to wake up the tower. The tower then receives the message, wakes up, and your phone gets coverage, allowing you to communicate. So this is a solution for for existing phones. So we sent the message, the base station woke up, and we're able to communicate, right? But again, if the network becomes idle, we go back to sleep. So then the question is, how long do we take? We set it up to be 5 minutes. So this means that you have the opportunity for bidirectional communication, right? You can go to sleep. I mean, the network comes up. If you send an SMS and they reply, that resets the timer. So you can go back and forth until there's no communication going on, and then it goes to sleep. So after a certain amount of inactivity, it goes to sleep. Great. That piece of virtual coverage is done. But there's another piece, which is incoming messages, right? This is all about users initiating communications. What if the communication comes from outside? That turns out to be much easier. We are the base station. We know that a call has come in. We can just turn on the power amplifier. So in this case, the message comes in. We turn on the power amplifier. We put the call on hold until the user arrives on the network. And if they do, we just route the call to them. So that's virtual coverage. It's a way to turn off the power amplifier and do smarter duty cycling while still providing connectivity when people need it. So how much power does this save? Again, the power amplifier dominated the power consumption. So if we turn it off, we save 86% of the power. But it depends primarily on the duty cycle, right? How often can the network be asleep? And we do what we do. We go and deploy it in the real world and see. So this analysis is over 5 months, February 15th, 2013 to July 16th, 2013. It was installed in a couple major locations. The most important thing to note here is the schedule. Because we're on that hydro, there's no reason to use virtual coverage when the hydro is running. That power is available. It's going to waste anyway. But the hydro gets turned off at night. And this is to refill the water reservoir. There's not enough water to power it, so they have this big pool they fill up, and then they power it during the day, and they turn it back off at night. So between 11 and 6 a.m., there is no hydro. And that's when we turned on virtual coverage. We're just trying to save power at night. This is very similar if we had just powered it with solar, which is super common. So we installed it in a couple locations in the communities, actually in the kiosks. And then you can see we put it face down so there'd be rain protected, all this stuff. We sent an SMS out to the community, like everyone, explaining how to use it. Hey, if you want to make a communication at night, come press the big red button at Sam's kiosk. We installed 3 of them and went from there. So here's the total number of messages that happened at night during virtual coverage periods. You can see inbound SMS dominated, but we still saw around 1,500 communications during the evaluation period. And incoming SMS dominating might be surprising unless you stop to think about the geography. Right? Papua is around 2 hours ahead of Java, which is by far the most densely populated island in Indonesia. So most of the users in Papua were kind of falling asleep while the people in Java were still sending them messages. So you're going to see it sort of tilted to that direction. But you still saw a good amount of outbound communication. We had a lot of stuff going on. So here's the actual usage per hour. You can see, again, everything is dominated towards this incoming messages at the 2300 and less so in the morning. This is primarily an artifact of that time difference. But it was used throughout all periods of the night. So virtual coverage was working to provide coverage even at times where there were very few users. Here's the number of events, like what caused wake-ups in our network. Let's see if I'm running out of time. I'm not. On the right, you can see incoming SMS, and those dominated again. But there were a good amount of wake-up radio events. So people did come out, hit the button, wake it up, and start communications. The key thing to remember with this graph is that each one of these could cause a conversation of both directional messages, right? Because the network stays up until no communication is going on. So virtual coverage was a success. We saw plenty of usage, around 1,500 messages, and the base station was in idle mode 87% of the time at night. So we were able to cut that power budget significantly. That means 56% total power savings. Basically, roughly half the batteries were required for this network over a traditional install. All right, great, right? Now we have a sustainable network that people like, that's low power and fits the community. There's a big problem. There's a big elephant in the room, and the elephant is regulatory, right? GSM is licensed spectrum, and it's expensive licensed spectrum. What you see is literally hundreds of millions of dollars for a carrier to come in and buy this kind of spectrum, and a small community doesn't have that for obvious reasons. So the problem here at its core is that these regulations were written in an era where this kind of equipment cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you buy a Nokia Siemens box, and you have hundreds of millions of dollars on top of it. But now that this new technology has enabled these new models of cellular access, we need a new regulatory framework. So stepping back into Indonesia, there are 5 carriers in Indonesia, and they own all of the spectrum. So this is great in places like Jakarta, where the spectrum is highly competitive and dense, and we need to manage that. But if you go out to Kalimantan or Papua, most of that spectrum is just unused, and there's no mechanism for someone else to use that spectrum, even though the carriers aren't. And that's what we want to implement. We wanted to make a mechanism for a smaller carrier, something we call a secondary, to reuse spectrum that the incumbents are not. So in starting this project, we sat down. And our technology, our answer is a thing we call GSM white spaces. So in sitting down and thinking about this project, this problem, we picked 5 requirements for a solution to this particular problem. The first is safety. The carriers paid an enormous amount of money for this spectrum, and they do not want to be interfered with, and they should not be interfered with. So that's the most important requirement. The second one is backwards compatibility. As I mentioned, we're not going to be able to change the handsets. So we need a way that works with existing 2G phones, the dominant communication paradigm at the moment. Spectrum flexibility is a really interesting requirement. Regulators and telecoms are really, really worried that if they hand over spectrum, they'll never get it back. So if a small person comes and puts together a service using spectrum and the incumbents come in, they might have a battle to get it back. So we need to show that we will never squat on frequency. We can use whatever frequency. The fourth one is independence. This means that the incumbents don't need to be involved. They're big organizations. They don't want to have to talk to every small organization in their country providing coverage. So we need to do the above 3 without their involvement. The last one is trustworthiness, which is that if you break any of the above 4, we can shut you down. The telecoms can shut you down. The regulators can shut you down. So here's our solution. Again, we have a cell phone network. We have our coverage. We have smiling, happy users. But now we have colors. So the colors are basically going to represent different frequencies. So an interesting property of the GSM protocol and your phone is that it does spectrum sensing. So each phone that you have has a mechanism to do scanning. This is used, so stepping back, what the tower does is it sends a message to your phone asking it to scan certain frequencies. This is used primarily for handover. So the idea here is that if I'm running an AT&T tower, I will send your phone a list of other AT&T towers to scan. Then it will report back which ones are really good, and you can then ask the phone to move to the new tower. So we abuse this basically to find incumbent towers or other cell phone networks in the area. So let's say there's an incumbent. We've got an incumbent on the upper left. We're able to ask a user who's in the overlapping coverage to scan the incumbent's tower. They report back that they see an incumbent tower, and then we change our frequencies. So now we're no longer interfering with them. So anyone with a background in wireless will immediately throw up on this, noting that actually what happens when we're sitting on the same frequency as an incumbent is interference. Nothing's going on in that space. So we have a little trick to resolve that. What we do is we basically run 2 cell phone networks concurrently. And I'll get to why this helps. So what we do is when we're on the blue frequency, we're scanning the next one, the green frequency. And upon noting that there is no green frequency in use, we move to that next one. And we switch, let's say, every 5 minutes. Now, this is great. This keeps us from ever interfering with an incumbent for very long. But the users would have a bad experience, right? They would have calls fail as they're moving constantly between frequencies. So what the second tower lets us do is basically we hand over a call to ourselves. You know, as you're on your phone driving on a highway, your phone is constantly moving the call between towers. So we use that same protocol to move the call to the new frequency that we just switched to. So this allows us to do this moving while the users see no impact in their behavior. Their calls keep going, their TCP connections stay going. So we keep cycling, and everything is great. But let's say that an incumbent appears, right? So now we're able to detect that incumbent, report that back, move everyone over without dropping it. So now we just scan the red one, and then move people over without dropping any calls. So this is the sort of base premise of GSM whitespace. And after now cycling, we avoid that incumbent because we detected them. We know they're there. So, but what about the case of interference, right? What if they are on the same frequency we are at that point? Again, it's just the switching time. So there will be interference, but after 5 minutes, we're going to switch. We note that there is no interference on blue. We move to the next frequency. Then we eventually scan green again, notice that they're there, and avoid them in the future. So the maximum interference time is capped at your switching, which is arbitrarily low. How often do we do rural cellular installations? AT&T does them once in a decade for a region, and we're switching every 5 minutes. So we think we've hit that. So we keep switching. Here's an example of a lab evaluation of this technology. So you can see up here, this is the secondary. ARFSN is a very specific GSM term. It means the absolute radio frequency channel number. It's just the channel the base station is broadcasting on. So here we're hopping back and forth between ARFSN 30 and ARFSN 20, which is going back and forth with our carrier. And here the incumbent arrives, right? They've just magically set up a brand new base station in our region. Well, we're able to detect them and start moving to ARFSN 40 instead. So now we're hopping between 20 and 40. The incumbent has seen no interference. Great, right? So we've hit our safety requirement. The max interference is our switching time. We're using the existing GSM protocol, probably abusing it, but it works. We have that spectrum flexibility. We're never on a frequency for very long. The incumbent doesn't need to be involved. They just come, set up towers, and we avoid them. Trustworthiness is the one that I missed. And trustworthiness is what we do. The way that we do trustworthiness is just a database on the back end. So every base station has to report to this database what frequencies they're using. And if an incumbent wants to limit a base station, they can set them to use no frequencies, for example. This is required because you'll have a lot of weird dynamic events happening if you have 2 of these base stations running with each other. So we really hit all 5 of these points. Again, we do things in the real world. This is an analysis of GSM whitespace running in DESA. Here our switching time is much lower, but the blue is us moving between different frequencies. So we moved roughly once every 8 hours throughout the GSM band. The green is everywhere we scanned that's open and available. And the red is where we saw a potential interference. Now, there's no other carriers in this place. We're 4 hours from cell phone coverage. So we think these are spurious results, but we still managed to avoid them. So we're pretty sure if a real incumbent ever appeared, we would similarly avoid them. So great, right? The spectrum hopping works. We're protecting incumbents. It's seamless to users. And we're successfully avoiding interference in the real world. We think this is a great mechanism in order to deal with the regulatory concerns to enable these kind of networks. So stepping out a little bit, this is all great, but we do value impact quite a bit. And so we've started a company to commercialize this research, and it's called Indaga. The big idea in Indaga is there's really two products that come out of Indaga. The first is this. This is the CCN1. It's a low-power, tower-mountable, weatherproof cell phone network in a box, right? Everything that I talked about earlier, making a version that doesn't have any cardboard in it. And that's what we've got right now. We're putting together a new version of it, but I think the more exciting piece of what we're building is this. This is the cloud management layer. Basically, the idea here is to provide a website so that you don't have to be as technically minded to run a cell phone network. The vast majority of the decisions you make when running one of these things can be automated. Picking a frequency is easy when you've got GSM white spaces, all of these things. So what are the important decisions for a rural entrepreneur to make? Things like setting prices, auditing usage if someone complains, and configuring their network name, things like this. So it's very similar to Meraki, if anyone knows about that particular company. So this is one thing that we've been doing, and it's going pretty well. So here's everywhere that Indaga is either operating or planning on operating, and I'll walk through a couple of them. There's Indonesia. Of course, this was our first trial network. We're expanding that trial, and we've actually got a partnership with another microgrid organization to put more there. We partnered with the university in Pakistan to do some installations in the northern areas. There's a community in northern Canada that doesn't have cell phone coverage. Is pretty excited to do that. Somalia is really interesting to me. So there's an entrepreneur in Mogadishu who has 2 boxes. And so this may not surprise you, but the regulatory environment in Somalia is very lax. There isn't one, right? So they can do that. This is going to be our only urban installation because it's so easy for them to get a spectrum license, so to speak. There's the Philippines. This is a partnership with the University of the Philippines, Diliman, to do some installs there. They have a lot of the same problems as Indonesia. Islands are hard to cover. And so we're excited to be working there. So this is everywhere we're like working at the moment. And everywhere else here is everywhere we received interest, like incoming communications from people living in rural areas that need coverage. So just to sort of state how big this problem is internationally, it's like, all of these places. So great, right? We've built a low-cost, community-owned and operated, sustainable cell phone network that's growing, and we've put together great mechanisms in order to regulate it. Where do we go now? There's a couple really interesting research agendas, I think, that are present. My favorite of which is over the top. If anyone knows about WhatsApp, it's a great example of this. The idea of WhatsApp was basically SMS is the most expensive data you'll ever pay for. And instead, if we use the data plane, we can get much cheaper messaging. So what WhatsApp did is they got people onto the data plane, but there's always this limitation of feature phones. But when you own the network, you can deploy things in the network to change this dynamic. So one thing that we've built, this is a student of mine, came together and he built a Facebook to SMS gateway. So in this network, you can send a message to a certain phone number. It's like 9999 plus your user ID for Facebook. And it will send that message as a Facebook message onto that user's account. So they'll receive just a Facebook message from you. You reply, and it'll show back up on your phone as an SMS. So this is the way to get away from the telecoms a little bit, because Facebook's happy for the traffic, and get people onto these modern services, even though they might be using feature phones in extremely remote areas. Similarly, I think there's just a broader space of local services. There's an enormous amount of work on voice services for these regions. Poly is a great example out of CMU. CGNet Swara is another one. Awaz Day is another one. These have been, I'll give an example through Poly. It's one of the ones I know better. Poly was this really cool service out of Pakistan, and what they did is it's like a game, right? They just have this cool video or audio game. You call in, you record your voice, and you send it to a friend. And on the side, they have a job board. The idea was to get people in with entertainment and then switch them over to the social benefit on the side. And Poly was huge. There's hundreds of thousands of messages in Pakistan. But the moment they made it so that it wasn't toll-free, usage dropped. And this has been a big problem for these voice services broadly. It's been a research agenda for a very long time. It's something I worked on for a little bit. But trying to make these sustainable is difficult. But when you own the network, that dynamic changes entirely. We can put Poly on our network and charge whatever we want for it, especially because it's running locally. There's actually no marginal cost to a call that just stays on the base station. So this enables these services being economically viable in network because you own the network. And you can actually go so far as to subsidize their use, because again, the credits are part of the network as well. So if you wanted to have a specific social function, you can give people credit to use it. So we're really excited about this whole space of services. This is one of the big pushes with a partnership in the Philippines. There's core tech still to be done. Kashif and I have actually been sitting on a new power amplifier design for quite a bit. The idea here is, in short, GSM is a TDMA protocol. And instead of turning the whole amplifier on or off, we can actually turn it on or off based on the frame. Because some frames aren't communicating, some frames are communicating. So if we do that, we can save all that power without needing a special phone. So we're working on that at the moment. Everything here needs to be updated to 4G. 4G is the future of cell phone networks, despite the fact that 4G is very poorly suited for rural areas. It's designed for small cell and urban areas. So there's a lot of interesting work to be done in terms of white space for 4G, community cellular for 4G, and 4G for rural areas. I think one really interesting thing we can do is that, again, we're running cell phone networks in rural areas, and so we can use these as an observational platform to see what life is like, what's going on in the network. So here's an example of a study I recently did. This will be at ICTD this year. This is just how many smartphones are in our community, and we related it basically to the rest of Indonesia. So you can see there's only about 16% of the phones are smartphones, but Android is by far the most dominant of those. And once you have this kind of data available to you, you can start to build services which encourage people to get on the internet. You can start to ask questions like, how does pricing affect phone adoption? It's this amazing platform for coming in and investigating interventions at a deeper level that's been impossible until you are literally a part of the network. I think disaster relief is one of the best use cases for this that I've seen, and I'm interested to step into that space. Right? You have these situations where all of the infrastructure is destroyed, but kind of comes up seemingly at random again. And so white space is hugely relevant, right? We drop a brand new cell phone network, autonomous, self-powered, and provide connectivity to either the community, emergency workers, any one of these things. If the incumbent networks come back up, we detect them, we move away from that. So this is a neat way to come in and provide connectivity in areas where existing infrastructure is damaged, but still allow that infrastructure to come back without any coordination. Network security has always been a side project of mine. I haven't been able to publish on it, but I think once you own a cell phone network, you can kind of see the damage you can do as a cell phone operator. So one thing that I've done is built this as a platform for demonstrating cellular attacks. We actually demoed this for the State Department and a number of activists. Just coming in and showing an activist what their phone is sharing and how their messages can be intercepted is a great advantage to actually see it happen. They send an SMS, I read their SMS back to them. And then you can see the limitations of a lot of the security tools out there. Things like Redphone, for instance, encrypt your call. But encrypting your call, encryption is really easy to detect. It doesn't look anything like a normal call. So I just blocked encryption on the network. Now Redphone is no longer usable. What do you do? So this is a great future venue for things that we can do to test defenses under real-world conditions when we own the network. Lastly, I've worked in a couple other areas that I thought I should mention. The first is education. This is MetaMouse. The big idea of MetaMouse was to take existing single-player games and automatically make them multiplayer. So this is for areas that didn't have enough resources and you always had sharing. So let's actually have the system support the sharing. And crowdsourcing. I've worked a little bit in crowdsourcing. This is Umadi, the crowdsourcing vending machine. The big idea here was to try to change the dynamics of crowdsourcing, get it off of the internet and into the real world with a kiosk. And once it's in the real world, you can start to leverage real-world properties like who's in an area, who's not in an area. And this allowed us to do sort of higher-end tasks that are really hard to do on traditional crowdsourcing engines. All right, thank you all very much. Yeah?
Have any of the incumbents in Indonesia complained yet?
No, I mean, the interesting thing about this is that everybody is super positive about it. I've talked to them for obvious reasons. I've talked to the regulators. This is solving a problem for them. They can't cover that area. They know they can't cover that area, and they want to get people on the cell phone network. So no, the incumbents are actually super supportive of the whole endeavor. Yeah.
Talk about capacity. How many people can cover one of these things?
Yeah, I didn't talk about capacity. It's like a fairly nuanced discussion of transmit power and like the number of channels we're running on. The maximum for one of these installations is 35 concurrent users, which we have to like do some Erlang math to figure out how many subscribers that is. It's plenty for 1,500 in short. We've never had an issue with capacity.
So in TV white spaces, people have tried to use the sensing kind of approaches, but say they see the hidden terminal problems and they see the power asymmetry problems, and they've gone to a database approach. Did you guys think about using a database, similar database approach in your?
Yes, there is a database on the back end of ours, and it's very similar to the TV white space idea. Now, it is, I think, a little different because the nature of a cell phone network means that you have literally hundreds of people on your network to be sensors. And that changes the dynamic such that we're fairly confident that we're not going to have a lot of those TV white space issues. But at the same time, the database gives you a lot of power, so we just do both. It's there. If the incumbents wanted to add their networks to that database as a blacklist of frequencies, it works. It's just we don't think they're going to do that. And instead, it's just going to be a reason to kill things. Well, they don't want to do things broadly. Like it's not a fast-moving industry. And it makes sense. These are enormous organizations, and they don't move fast on a lot of things. And they've paid a lot of money for it, and so they're not going to be very flexible. So we just wanted to make life as easy as possible for them. So they don't have to do anything, and our stuff still works. And there's actually a trial going on right now to really prove that with an existing telecom. Yeah?
Are there any significant social changes that accompany a community gaining cell phone access?
So I would say it depends on your definition of significant. Now, there's always this idea that like technology comes in via helicopter and changes everything, and that's just not the way the world works. It's always marginal. Like they had satellite phones before us, and they had a trip to Wamena. It was a 4-hour drive, and it cost $20, but they had it. And so all we did is make things easier. So at the same time, a certain amount of making things easier can cause some dramatic changes. So one thing is in difference between our network and the prior ones was personal ownership. Right now you own a smartphone, or just a phone, versus you had to go to a kiosk, knock on their door, and use their satellite phone. So this does seem to have changed some things. We've seen a lot of weird social behavior, like the kids I mentioned talking to each other and their parents being worried about that. The Footloose story I mentioned, there was some of the military people in the community tried to organize basically a party, and the network allowed one of the church owners to contact the head of the military to shut that down. And so you see things like this that maybe wouldn't have happened before but are now happening. I don't know if that counts as significant. In my head, absolutely. Like this is changing the dynamics in the community. But it's certainly not like some sort of magic bullet has arrived and now that they're doing currency transfer and like everything's cheaper. You don't see that kind of stuff.
Okay, thank you very much, Curtis.
Thank you.